Welcome to another episode of Nathan Builds Robots. So today we're going to be talking about Liberation Day here in America. Apparently we're putting all these new tariffs on other countries around the world, and I just want to explain to you what's going on with that, how that's going to affect the 3D printing industry, and what exactly these numbers on Trump's billboard here mean. Because it's kind of misleading the way that they talk about this. It's saying that if the US were to export things to China, it would cost a 67% tariff. Alright, hello and welcome to another episode of Nathan Builds Robots. Today I wanted to do a quick episode about the new Trump tariffs and how that's going to affect the 3D printing industry. President Trump made his announcement about these tariffs in a speech yesterday, and he rolled out all these specific numbers of tariffs charged to the USA and the US's reciprocal tariffs. And it's showing that these are discounted tariff rates, so it's half of what it should be, according to him. But these numbers on the left aren't actually the tariff rates that other countries are charging us. It's like this calculated rate, which I was curious about the math, so I dug into it a little bit more, and we'll be talking about it here. Also, I'll go over some specific examples of 3D printers and filament, and how we can expect to see the prices change based on these new tariffs. Now, what is a tariff? A tariff is basically just a tax on imported goods. So if you're buying a 3D printer or some filament from, let's say, China, then you're going to have to pay a new 34% reciprocal tariff now. So if you are buying, for example, a Bambu Lab X1C, then you're going to have to pay a little more than 30% of the sale price of this printer as a tariff. Actually, you won't be paying this tariff, the importer will be paying it, which is actually Bambu Lab themselves. Because they have a US warehouse, they're basically exporting the printers from China into the United States and then selling them to you directly from the US warehouse. So instead of having to pay tariffs on this $1,200 price tag, they're actually paying tariffs on the wholesale price of their printers, which they can claim is like $800 or $500 or whatever they claim the wholesale value is when they're doing that transfer from China to the United States. Let's just assume that they're claiming a wholesale value of $600, half the MSRP, then they'll be paying 600 times 0.34. They'll be paying an extra $200 in tariffs in order to import these printers, and then that price will be probably passed on to you. They might eat a little bit of that cost, but it's going to be hard to imagine a situation where the prices don't go up at all. Now, in the worst case, you could see this MSRP increase from $1,200 to $1,400, and in the best case, Bambu Lab just eats all that cost. In reality, it'll probably be somewhere in between, so maybe it'll go up by $100, and Bambu Lab themselves will help pay for $100 of that increased tariff. Now, when I saw these numbers, I thought there was something a little bit off about them. If you look at the actual tariff rates that these other countries are charging when the US exports products into those foreign markets, you're actually looking at a tariff rate of about 12 to 17%. The so-called value-added tax. So when you import some kind of US product into China, for example, they'll charge a 12% premium on that price. So let's say you sold something to a Chinese person in China for $1,000. When they get that import, then they're going to have to pay a 12 to 17% tariff on it. So they'll have to pay $120 in taxes. It says here 67%, which is like 4 to 6 times more than the actual tariff rate on like products that you're actually exporting to China. But they have a formula for this, and I think it's prudent to go over this formula just so that we can understand how these numbers were calculated. So this is from the Office of the United States Trade Representative, and this goes over the formula that they were using. Now, instead of actually looking up the tariff rate of these countries, which this chart would kind of indicate is what they did, instead, they just looked at the net imports from that country and the net exports to that country from the United States, and they did a little calculation here. And there's an article by the Wall Street Journal that kind of explains it a lot better than I could, so I'll just cite this, and we're going to take a look at this, this graph here. So in Trump's ideal world, the imports and exports with any given trade partner would be exactly even. So in that case, let's say we import $1 billion worth of 3D printers, and in order to have trade balance with that partner, we would need to export $1 billion worth of soybeans. But in this case, we're importing, let's say, $2 billion of 3D printers, and we're only exporting $1 billion worth of soybeans, so that's a trade deficit. And in the case of a 2-to-1 trade deficit, And according to these calculations, Donald Trump would consider that to be a 50% effective tariff. So in the case of South Korea, it looks like we have a 2-to-1 ratio of imports to exports. So he considers that a 50% effective tariff, which I kind of disagree with this methodology and to call it a tariff, but really it's a trade imbalance. The idea is that we're seeing a trade imbalance and we want that trade imbalance to go to zero. So we're going to tax those imported goods to discourage importation. And the idea is that the imports will taper off and our exports will stay the same, and eventually we'll reach a trade balance, and then we can drop the reciprocal tariffs. It's kind of a weird definition of tariffs, but that's what they're going with here. And the idea is that that accounts for certain things like currency manipulation and foreign subsidies of their domestic industry. So for example, I hear a lot about how Chinese manufacturing is subsidized by the Chinese government. That's not going to be captured in a tariff rate on imports from the US to China. So they're just kind of throwing in this fudge factor based on our trade deficit with those countries. For other countries where we're running a trade surplus, we're going to just charge them a flat tariff of 10%. So any of these countries that are saying 10% here, we either have a perfectly even trade balance or we're running a trade surplus. But instead of being like, we're going to subsidize some of their products and tax our exports, they're just like, screw it, they're still going to owe us 10%. If we look at how these tariffs are geographically distributed, it looks like Europe is being hit with a 20% tariff. Most of the rest of the world is being hit with a 10% tariff. And then all of Asia, or a majority of these Asian countries, are going to face anywhere between 20 and 40% of tariffs. Especially bad is we've got Vietnam here with 46%. Now this has absolutely wreaked havoc on the US stock market. Nobody's sure what companies they should invest in, and we've seen the S&P 500 drop off about 4% since Trump made this announcement. And just looking at the ticker bars on the top of Wall Street Journal, you can see basically everything is down. US bonds are up, which are supposed to be a reliable source of return on investment, and the volatility index is up. I wasn't sure what this thing was, so I clicked on it, and this is the volatility index. Apparently this is some kind of index used to measure how volatile the stock market is, and this is doing pretty well with all these crazy things going on in global trade. So given that this tariff is born out of a trade deficit, I'm going to go over some of the things that China exports to the United States and some of the things that the United States exports to China. Because in order for these tariffs to go away without some kind of other negotiation, according to those calculations, we're going to need to export as much stuff to China as we import from China. Now, in terms of Chinese exports that are entering the United States, of course, we have 3D printers. That's basically everyone who watches this channel has a 3D printer. So that was most likely imported from China, unless you got it from a company like PRUSA, RatRig, or one of the giant industrial manufacturers like Stratasys or Formlabs. I would consider those electronics, and that's the largest category of imports that we get from China. Apparently, we import over $70 billion worth of smartphones and mobile devices. A big part of that is iPhones, but basically every electronic device that we use on a daily basis is manufactured in China. Then we also have computer accessories, again, that's mostly made in China, and consumer electronics. I think this is the category that 3D printers would fall into, and again, that's mostly imported from China. We also have industrial machinery and mechanical appliances, household appliances, textiles and apparel, so most of your clothes that you're wearing, most of the tools that you use on a regular basis, like hammers, tape measures, that kind of stuff. Most of that is imported from China. We have furniture and bedding, so if you're decorating your house or want some clean sheets to sleep on, that's probably being imported from China. Notably, a lot of mattresses are actually produced in the United States because they're big and heavy and difficult to transport. So we have a lot of mattress manufacturing here. You'd have to check on each specific model, but I think the memory foam mattresses will tend to be made in China because they're easier to ship. You shrink them down and vacuum pack them, and they seal up pretty small, so it's easy to produce those in China and ship them over here. I don't think they're as comfortable, and they're just made out of a bunch of gross chemicals, so I prefer the US-made mattresses whenever possible. Also, we've got toys, games, sports equipment, so a lot of this is like stuff that you'll use at the gym, or if you're looking at a school, all of the sports equipment and toys and stuff. That stuff is made in China for the most part. Another smaller category is vehicles and parts. So a lot of auto manufacturers will use subcomponents that are made in China. Even if the car is built in the United States, they'll import those and install them onto their vehicles. So yeah, we import a lot of finished and consumer goods from China into the United States. And for the most part, we haven't been charging much in order for China to participate in our market and be able to sell things to the US consumer. If you look at a place like Europe, they have their own tariffs and value-added taxes, such that when you get an iPhone that's imported from China and you buy that in the EU, it ends up being quite a bit more expensive than what we would have in the United States. But that might all be coming to an end with the introduction of these new tariffs. And after talking to a lot of European people about what they think about, the ability to get cheap electronics in the United States, they were a little bit jealous about that when I tell them, how much I pay for my electronics and my cameras and stuff, because they have to pay an additional 200 or 300 euros for the same thing. But at the end of the day, they're like, yeah, but that's okay because I'm getting a lot of benefits from the government. I get cheaper healthcare and cheaper housing, and I think that balances out to be in my favor. But now in the United States, we're going to have more expensive healthcare, more expensive housing, and more expensive cheap consumer goods. So it's just going to be really expensive all around to live here. And what I'm expecting to see is some inflation because of that. A lot of this data is actually provided by the government. So if you go to the Census Bureau, census.gov, you can look up what those trade deficits are. You can download a spreadsheet and you can check their math and come up with the same numbers that the Trump administration did. Now, when we look at exports from the US to China, we're going to need to see these go up in order for those reciprocal tariffs to go away. So what exactly are we exporting to China? On this website, usafacts.org, we can take a look and see. So if we look at the top exports from the United States in general, we export a lot of oil products and civilian aircrafts and parts. So in these top three categories, this is all basically the petroleum and oil business. And in these smaller segments, we have civilian aircrafts and parts, vehicles, and integrated electronics and circuitry. Now, this civilian aircraft and parts, we actually have a pretty big aerospace business in the United States. A lot of companies like Boeing, Gulfstream, Cessna, they'll all manufacture planes in the United States and then sell them all over the world. This vehicles segment, I'm not sure exactly who we're selling vehicles to. It seems like the US imports a lot more vehicles than we export, and a lot of this might actually be exports to Canada. Not exactly sure where we're exporting our vehicles to, but it seems like for the most part the US is a net importer of vehicles. And then we've got electronic integrated circuits. You've got companies like NVIDIA, Intel, AMD, Texas Instruments. They're all manufacturing chips and exporting those to other countries. Now, notably, a lot of these integrated circuits are being manufactured in places like Taiwan and China, but we do manufacture quite a bit of that stuff in the United States as well. What are the top products that we export to China? Number one is soybeans. So if you're a farmer, this will probably affect you a lot. We've also got electronic circuits, crude oil, blood, vaccines. So a lot of these will probably be from Boeing or similar companies, cars and vehicles, and corn. So it looks like of all of these major exports that go from the US to China, a lot of these are basically farm-raised goods. You're talking about soybeans and corn. If China were to introduce retaliatory tariffs to all this stuff that we've just introduced, then you might see farmers being hit the hardest because they won't have a market for their goods anymore. And in order to keep them in business, the US is going to have to buy up those goods or find other markets to dump them into. So overall, I consider this formula a little bit disingenuous to describe this calculated rate as a tariff. Because if you actually look at these things, even if China or the EU were to drop their tariff rate to 0%, then you would still have an effective tariff rate according to that calculation, even though they're not actually charging tariffs on the goods. So you could just as easily see these countries being like, hey, you know what, we're not actually charging you 39% or 67%, but if you want to charge us this amount, then we can charge you that amount and tax your stuff when you're importing it to our country. And that would be more of an apples-to-apples comparison in terms of actual tariffs. At least that's my opinion of it. If you disagree, let me know in the comments down below. So we can already see this having huge impacts on our stock market performance. The S&P 500, which is a really stable index that a lot of people put their retirements and life savings into, which generally goes up over time. If you look at its performance in the last 5 days, since he's announced the tariff plan, it's dropped 4%. And you can see it already causing problems in US domestic manufacturing. So for instance, here in this article from NJ.com, they're documenting they're laying off 900 US auto workers because of these tariffs and the possibility of having to shut down plants in Mexico and China. Because we've built up these complex supply chains and manufacturing networks where the components need to cross the borders a couple times, and if they're being taxed every time you're sending a part over the border, then it doesn't make sense to have any of that supply chain. It's going to have to be shut down, which will mean a loss in jobs on the US and Mexico and Canada side while they reconsolidate that production line in the United States. Also, when we look at these categories of products that we import from China, a lot of this is electrical machinery and mechanical components and machinery. This is the type of stuff that you need to produce a factory. So if you're thinking like, hey, we'll just start up factories in the United States, well, we import a lot of machinery from China, from Japan, from Germany. So if you're going to start a factory, all of a sudden that's become 20 to 30% more expensive. And when you're trying to source raw goods, that's going to be also more expensive because we import a lot of raw materials from other countries like Canada, Mexico, and China. So if the true intent was to boost US manufacturing, it would make sense to collect all of these tariffs into a bucket and then redistribute it into US manufacturing efforts to help keep US manufacturing from getting more expensive. But instead, what we're going to see is prices increase across the board, whether those goods are being imported or whether they're being produced domestically out of new factories. Another thing that's a little worrying about all of these changes that are coming across is we're not actually sure how serious Trump is in terms of keeping these tariffs for a long time. If you're going to finance some new capital equipment, let's say you want to buy some new CNC machines, build a new factory building, train up a new workforce to be able to work those factory jobs, you're looking at a situation where it's going to take 2 to 10 years for that investment to pay for itself. So if you're a company and you're like, oh man, we're going to be hit with these tariffs, time to move all of our production into the United States, you make this huge capital investment building a factory in the United States, and then 2 years later, Trump decides, you know what, tariffs are over, we reached a deal with that other country, so we're canceling the tariffs on them. Well, that means your competitor who decided to not build a factory and who instead just decided they were going to pay the tariff, that competitor is going to be in a much better situation than you because their investments weren't tied up in opening a US factory, and they're still going to get the benefit of lower prices once those tariffs are canceled. And, you know, if we get another president, let's say a Democrat gets elected in 4 years, then they're probably going to cancel a lot of these tariffs because of just the way the two-party system works. So it's really hard to make the argument that as a factory owner, you should invest in a United States factory where you can build things here, because it's not certain if these trade barriers are going to be here for a long time or if they're just here for a couple of days while Trump is trying to come up with a deal with those other countries where they're going to drop their trade restrictions with the United States. Now let's talk about a couple specific examples. I just talked about the Bambu Lab X1C. Let's say they're manufacturing those in China for $300. Then they're exporting them to the United States with a wholesale value of $600. And then they're paying a $200 tariff on that. Then all of a sudden, in order to maintain the same profit margin, they're going to have to sell this for $1,400. So that'll make this printer really expensive. Now let's look at a cheaper example. Let's say we had the Bambu Lab A1 Mini. Let's say they're producing those in China for $40. Then they're exporting them to the United States for $80 at a wholesale price of $80 a unit. Then they're selling them to you, the consumer, for $240. Then they'll have a net profit of $160. And on that $80 wholesale price, we have 80 times 0.34. So if they want to maintain the same profit margin, they'd have to increase the price to, let's say, $280. And here's the problem that I have with these tariffs in general, is that they're probably not going to have the desired effect for most US industries. Because if I were to produce a US-made competitor to the Bambu Lab A1 Mini, it would cost me more than $40 in parts, I think it's safe to say. If I actually go through the bill of materials and look at how much I could get each of these components for, I imagine it'd probably be about $100 in components, and then I could get that assembled in the United States, but due to the increased costs of doing business here, both the real estate and how much you have to pay your employees, I could probably get this thing manufactured for about $150 to $160 in the United States. But in China, they're able to build these things extremely inexpensively just because of how efficient the factories are over there. They can afford to export a finished unit of this machine for a lower price than I can import the parts. And then I have to build it. And, at the end of the day, even with that 34% tariff, your cheapest option is still going to be to make it in China. So I don't think we're going to see some kind of 3D printer manufacturing revolution where we're going to get the next Bamboo Lab factory built in Texas. But who knows, that might be a thing. Would be pretty interesting if that happened. But yeah, if I just went and bought each individual component and tried to put it together here, it's still going to be horribly cost ineffective compared to having this thing made in China and just importing it and paying the tariff. When we look at a printer like the PRUSA Core 1, they're going to have to pay a 20% import tariff, and that's going to drive the cost up. However, if you look at Printed Solid, they're actually they've been acquired by PRUSA, so they're going to start building printers in the United States. And we take a look at the PRUSA XLs and PRUSA i3s. It looks like we can buy them here, and that would sort of bypass the tariffs. However, there's a lot of components that go into these printers that will have to be imported from Prague and also imported from China, to the point where it's kind of coming out in a wash. You might save a couple percent in terms of not having to pay those import tariffs, but you're having to pay the tariffs on all the components that go into it. So we're not going to see a situation where we see prices go down because of these tariffs. Universally, across the board, prices are probably going to go up. Another interesting case is Filament. So if we take a look at Filament from Printed Solid, the nice thing about this is PLA is for the most part manufactured in the United States, and then you can turn that into filament in the United States. So that's a purely made in America product that won't be subject to tariffs. However, companies like Polymaker with their Polylite filament, I believe all of this is formulated and extruded in China. So they get the pellets, which might be imported from the United States into China. They get their additives, they mix it all together and extrude it into filament. And then when they import that to the United States, they're going to have to pay a tariff on it. So companies like Polymaker, they might expect to see their profit margins go down and their prices go up. But a company like Printed Solid, since it's all based in the US, their prices will either remain the same or slightly go up to deal with the increased demand. After all, pricing is determined by supply and demand, so if we have more demand for these products because now they're the cheapest option on the market, then logically they will want to increase their prices a little bit so they have more profit margin and can invest into more equipment to meet the larger demand. Another example is kit printers. You're buying these as a kit and then building it yourself in the United States, but these kits themselves will be subject to tariffs because most of these components, whether it's the linear bearings, the rotary bearings, the belts, the stepper motors, basically all this stuff comes from China. So the kit is going to be more expensive. So if you were thinking, yeah, I'll just build my own printer to get around the tariffs, yeah, that's not really a good way to get around it. You'll have to pay those tariffs one way or another because you're using parts and components from another country. Now, what do I think about all this? Well, I don't want to get political on this channel. I really don't care who you voted for. But I do think that it's important for us to talk about this stuff in a non-political environment. Everything's become so polarized that I feel like a lot of people get defensive and angry when they talk about these topics. But I think it's going to be best if we can, in the 3D printing community, discuss this in an apolitical way and just kind of talk about how this is affecting us, whether it's going to be a good or bad thing for the industry. And, you'll hear stories from people who you might be able to relate to a little bit more than just seeing, oh, there's the MAGA guy, or oh, there's that libtard over there. I think we need to take these conversations back from the political arena and start having discussions in these smaller sub-communities that are a little more tightly knit, because I think we might find that we get along and agree with each other a lot more than you would if you were just looking at people in terms of being red or blue. Also, please remember that a lot of people's lives and livelihoods depend on the type of decisions that are being made at the executive level and the type of tariffs and global trade that are going on. These days, I make my living as a 3D printing YouTuber. Obviously, if prices of all 3D printers and all 3D printing goods go up, in general, we can expect to see less people engage with the hobby, and people who are already in the hobby are probably going to be spending less because, everything's just going to be more expensive. So at the end of the day, that's going to hurt my bottom line as a 3D printing YouTuber. But it's not all bad news for me. I've worked in a lot of manufacturing and engineering industries, which, if you're to believe the long-term goals of this tariff plan, should benefit from the tariffs that have been put in place. So we should see a reemergence of manufacturing and engineering work in the United States, which will benefit me in terms of my job viability and how much I'll be able to get paid. But I think the more likely situation is we're just going to see inflation across the board, and that's not going to be good for anyone. Personally, I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with importing stuff from other countries and even having a trade deficit with other countries, because at the end of the day, you're receiving the goods and services that you need for your everyday life and your hobbies and all that kind of stuff. Also, there's some longer-term effects that might actually hurt American industry. For example, according to these charts, we export a lot of oil and gas and farm products. If other countries don't like the tariffs that we've all of a sudden applied to them, they might decide, you know what, we're going to put a tariff on the stuff that you're exporting to us. So it might actually worsen the trade deficit. So this is a really complex topic, and it's not as simple as apply tariffs equal trade balance. Curious to see how all this turns out. It'll definitely be interesting times to come. And just to give one last kind of relatable example to how this affects people who are wanting to start their own business and start manufacturing stuff in the United States, if you wanted to start your own print farm using printers from China, all of a sudden your startup costs just went up, and also your material costs are probably going to go up as well. So that's just like one small example of how these tariffs actually make things more difficult to manufacture in the United States, to the point where it's not clear whether it's going to really benefit US manufacturing in the long run. Especially if the tariffs get dropped after 2 or 4 years, then, that's just messing things up for no reason. Alright, so that's all I had for you today. Let me know what you're going to personally do to respond to these tariffs, whether it's going to affect your spending in the 3D printing hobby, or maybe you're going to find things are too expensive now and you're going to be looking for other hobbies. Now, I might be able to recommend a few. I just started running, so maybe you'll get into running or exercising or something, which will probably be a lot healthier for you in the long run than 3D printing. Alright, thanks for watching this episode of Nathan Builds Robots, and I'll see you in the next one.